Hi, my name is Winslet, and welcome to my video on Dragon Breath weapons, scales, and auras in the Dragon Dawn DLC for Age of Wonders 4. I got an early access key to this content a couple weeks ago, but it took me a while to even notice that you could swap out your dragon weapon to be a different affinity and the implications that came along with that. I think a big reason that I missed those details is the game doesn't do a very good job of telling you what your choice is actually going to do. And so I created this image to basically put all of the numbers from those choices in one place. For example, if we look here, I can choose to be one of these 6 affinities right here, but all it really tells me is that I'll get some fire damage. And once we load into the game as a Chaos Dragon here, we can see that he gets some hero skills, which are different based off of that decision, but it doesn't label anywhere in here that this comes from the Chaos Affinity and that this aura that they get at the capstone of their special Dragon Lord Ruler skills is a Chaos Affinity thing. I mean, it does say Chaos Aura right there at the top, so you can figure that out, but it's not immediately obvious. I really wish that you could go to the in-game encyclopedia and find more information on the auras. But unfortunately, I had to go through and start up a game and take some screenshots in order to make my image. If you wanted to look at the dragons that you get from the Dragon Dawn DLC, the extra units that you get from the Tier 3 tome, you can look at the auras they get by typing in dragon. But yeah, it just would be nice to be able to find this type of information by typing auras up here at the top. Or if you wanted to like look up metals, it'd be great to be able to just do that really quickly. All right, now with that out of the way, I think we can actually look at this image in more detail. I've got a lot of little images with a lot of little numbers here, so we'll start off by zooming in to show off that the Materium Dragon gets a effect on their breath attack. They can cause bleeding right at the beginning of the game. Nature Dragon can cause poison with their little cone breath attack. Chaos can cause burning. Order causes distracted, Astral causes electrified, and Shadow causes frozen. I have to say, frozen is really, really powerful, and distracted is really powerful. I was watching a video talking about how damage over time in Age of Wonders 4 triggers at the end of an enemy's turn, meaning they get to use their actions. Whereas if you freeze somebody, then they don't get their actions. Or if you distract somebody so that all of your units can get enough damage from the flanking attacks, because distracted makes it so all attacks on that unit count as flanking. If you kill a unit, then they don't get their actions. So I think Order and Shadow have the two strongest ones. I have to say though, I think Shadow is probably the strongest out of all of the Dragon Breaths, just, looking at them right here. And then if we look at our dragon scales, what's really interesting is Materium gets something pretty different than the rest of the dragons. The other affinity dragons all get a little bit of resistance based on what they do. I mean, the Chaos guy does fire, so they get fire resistance. The Nature guy does blight, so they get blight resistance. Order does spirit, so they get spirit resistance. Same with all of these other ones. Astral, same deal. Does lightning, gets lightning resistance. Shadow does frost damage, and it gets frost resistance. But if we go back to our Materium Dragon here, they get a little bit more just general resistance, which means it's easier for that to be applied. So after, looking at the scales, you might start to think Materium is better, but there's more to take into consideration. It's not just the breath attack and the scales. There's the thing you get when you have enough hero skills. I think it's something like 6 or 7 hero skills in the Dragon Lord thing should allow you to unlock their capstone. So Materium gets the ability to bolster defense and sunder defense on enemies, so you can make your allies harder to deal damage to using physical attacks, and make it easier to do physical damage to your enemies by using the placement of your dragon. Um, the nature dragon gets regeneration, which is incredibly powerful. I've been hearing some stories about people getting their dragons to level 12 by turn 6 because of how powerful they can be in manual combat and auto combat. Um, and this regeneration makes it so that the dragon gets a lot of regeneration and all of the units around them get a lot of regeneration, but you don't really need the other units to get it. If your dragon is an incredible powerhouse of damage and just takes a little bit of damage every turn, not enough to kill it, just enough to draw the enemies close enough to it so it can use its like tail attack or its cone attack. I think nature is probably most people's favorite because of like this aura. Chaos aura makes it so that you can give people a random status effect. This is just going to affect enemies, so you have to use your chaos dragon a little bit more aggressively if you're going to take this aura. I feel like that can be really good, or it can be really useless. So in a lot of ways, this one is probably one of the worst auras. Oops, I meant to go up here. And I don't see anything else in the scales or the breath that I feel like really makes up for the fact that this could end up being very ineffective on a lot of fights. It probably isn't worth taking the point for. Whereas if we look at the aura, the order aura, I think it's quite good. Getting rally, fortune, and bolstered resistance is very nice. Bolstered resistance makes it harder for people to do um, magic damage to you. Fortune makes it so you have a higher crit chance. And I'm actually going to look up rally quickly in game just to see what that does. All right, yeah, rally is just +5 morale at the end of the turn. So all in all, I would say the Order of Aura is quite good. It's definitely better than the Chaos Aura, worse than the Nature Aura, and I'd say better than the Materium Order because it's it's all focused on your friendly units, and it's a little bit easier to put your dragon next to friendly units than it is to get them next to enemies for the Sundering Defense. I mean, you might also be facing somebody who does a bunch of magic damage, so Materium wouldn't be too helpful against somebody like that. And Astral does something very similar to Materium. It's kind of like the antithesis, or the opposite. It gives bolstered resistance, making it so that the dragon and the adjacent friendly units are going to be harder to do magic damage to. And it also makes it so if you put your dragon next to enemy units that they get sundered resistance. I mean, this is very versatile. It definitely has its benefits, but it's different from order in that it I feel like it's slightly harder to get as much value out of. The dragon one is interesting because it causes misfortune, which makes it so that people have a higher fumble chance. They're more likely to not do their maximum amount of damage. They'll like downgrade their attack when they take their attack if it ends up actually fumbling. And that is, yeah, it's similar to the Order Aura in that it only does one thing. It's focused on affecting enemy units, and that can be very hard to get to trigger. But if you can lean into this enough and protect your dragon, keep them alive next to some enemy units, that can be very valuable at reducing the damage output from a bunch of the like uh, DPS or the units that deal a lot of damage per second. And that's everything that I had to say on the Affinity Dragon choices. Now we have just a few other auras, and these are the ones that come with the tier 5 dragons. There's a fire aura from the tier 5 dragon unit, which evolves from a young fire dragon. There's the frost aura, which is similar, comes from a tier 5 frost dragon, and that evolves from the frost young dragon. And the spirit aura comes from, the golden dragon, and the lightning aura comes from the um, obsidian dragons. And just looking at these all here, I feel like my favorite one is probably the frost aura or the lightning aura. They're both pretty similar. They both do 6 damage, and they have a chance to take the actions away from an enemy. This Spirit Ore is interesting in that it just does damage, and the Fire one has a higher chance of inflicting burning than the other guys have for inflicting their uh, action removing status effect. So, I'd say these are pretty comparable across the board. Uh, Being able to do more damage is always nice, especially if that allows you to kill a unit when, you know, doing less damage wouldn't kill a unit. But I have to say, I think being able to take actions away from units that still have health is more valuable in general. Oh, right. And of course, the lightning aura is something that only evil players are going to have access to because you can only recruit the obsidian dragons if you are evil alignment. If we look here at the young dragon here, it says you can only get the young obsidian dragons if you have an alignment that is lower. Um, or evil, and you can only get the young golden dragons if you've got good alignment. So I guess in a lot of ways, then going back to this image, the frost aura is better than the lightning aura, but if you have a bunch of frost units, so a bunch of like frost dragons, somebody can bring fire against you, and all of a sudden your entire army is very vulnerable to that type of damage. Whereas if you got a couple obsidian dragons and a couple frost dragons, then you're going to be a little bit harder to counter. So that is worth keeping in mind. So right as I was getting ready to call it a day, I noticed that I left some important details out of the table here. There are 4 more breaths that you get from the tier 5 dragons: the fire breath, frost breath, purifying breath, and lightning breath. So in total, we have 10 breaths. 10 auroras and a bunch of different scales, 2 scales for each of the affinities. I think that's 12 different scale options. And the breaths actually do factor into which of these dragons are better in different situations quite a bit, actually. The fire breath is pretty basic. It just has a pretty high chance of inflicting burning, which works well with certain builds, but I have to say it's probably one of the lower breaths from the tier 5 dragons. Frost breath has a chance to slow, which, as I talked about earlier, I think is quite good. And when we compare that to the purifying breath is a pretty close second, I would say, but I think the frost breath is actually the best one because it has the ability to take away action points. Being able to dispel negative status effects is massive. That is will make it so that you can get rid of things like misfortune, which forces fumbles, as well as a bunch of other really nasty status effects. And healing is always pretty good too. There aren't a lot of things that do both healing and removing status effects in an AOE, in such a large AOE. So that's a pretty valuable unit if you can get that tier 5 dragon. You have to be a good alignment to do that, so keep that in mind. But the evil guys, they have the ability to electrify on their breath, which is quite a bit worse than the frost breath. So I actually think out of all these dragons, the tier 5 frost dragon is the best one. Maybe followed up by the golden dragon or the obsidian dragon, and I just feel like the fire dragon is the worst one out of the 4. And yeah, that's everything I have for you today. Thanks for joining me in this video. I'll see you around. Have a good one.